So I'm going to give you a sense of what a poet's like. Here is a poet at home. Here is a poet at the office. And again, back home, just entertaining friends, casual evening. These are images of the poet Sappho. Sappho is an incredibly powerful figure as a poet. We only know about her work through fragments. She lived around 620 BC, and most of her work just didn't survive for whatever reason. The collection that I have at home is literally called Fragments of Sappho, and even through that you can just hear this exceptionally powerful voice of this woman who lived on an island called Lesbos. That's where we get the word lesbian from. She was a love poet, and she had an exceptionally strong voice. She didn't live a life that I can relate to very much. My life looks a little bit different. These are some of the things that I get up to on a normal day. And this is probably the first thing I want to bring up in terms of unpacking the critical voice, because for me, the fact that I spend so much time not writing poetry it's something that I think about. It's a criticism that I have of myself. Poets have a weird rule that I'm not allowed to say I'm a poet until you tell me that I am. It's very strange. I don't think any other creative practitioners have that. And another weird one that you may or may not relate to, which is I'm only a poet when I'm writing poetry. So if that's true, I'm a poet about 2% of the time. So it doesn't seem like a particularly good run rate. But that's just a little picture of my life day to day. And this is a timeline of my achievements as a poet. I was told from a very young age that I would be a writer, I would be a poet. And I woke up one day and realized that hadn't happened. It just didn't seem to eventuate magically. And I realized that I actually had to start writing at about the age of 27. I figured that out. After I started writing, I started reading, and this is a common thing. I don't know what it's like in your creative practices, but we tend to jump the gun a bit and just start writing poetry and then realize that we should probably read what other people have done. Starting a podcast really helped with that, because if I don't read, I would have absolutely nothing to say. Eventually, I put together a couple of books. One of them came out in December 2019. The other one came out in March 2020, which was excellent timing, as you can imagine. So that's another thing that sort of swirls around in my own critical voice is I started way too late. Some of the poets I want to talk about today had already written their entire body of work by the time I started writing my first poem. I imagine there are some people here who can relate to some of that. And then there are other elements that inform my own critical voice, and some of those are historical figures, such as this guy. This is Ezra Pound. You've probably seen somebody who looks very much like this drinking at Kent Street. He is an exceptionally powerful voice, just like Sappho, but a very different person, a very, very different person. This quote here, "You're never going to be any good as a poet. Why don't you take up something useful?" which is something he casually said to a younger poet called James Lachlan. James Lachlan took that advice very much to heart. He stopped writing poetry completely. He took his father's money and he founded a publishing house called New Directions. Because of New Directions, we have the poets who I look up to and admire the work of today. So in a way, thank God for this piece of criticism, but also it changed the entirety of James Lachlan's life. Ezra Pound is famous for probably one of the shortest lasting poems that we know of, "In a Station of the Metro," that goes like this: "The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough." That's the whole thing. People lose their minds over that piece of work. He also wrote this huge tome, 800 pages, called The Cantos. Apparently he wrote this while he was in prison. I've never read The Cantos. I don't think anyone's read The Cantos. And I work next to a guy in a little co-working space in Fitzroy, and he has a poetry collection, even though he's a He's a music composer, but he has heaps of poetry books. And yesterday I saw that he had his copy of the cantos out. I was like, oh my God, he's reading it. But then I realized he was using it to prop something up, which makes sense. The other thing that it would be remiss of me not to mention about Ezra Pound is that he had some extremely questionable politics. I won't waste your time with them, but you can look them up if you care to. When we talk about Ezra Pound, we always mention this. You can kind of time it, how long it takes to bring this up. Ezra Pound edited The Wasteland, T.S. Eliot's famous long poem. And for some reason, poets go nuts over this because, as you can see, he was not a kind editor. He crossed out entire pages. And poets like to recite this fact back to each other. You know, he crossed out entire pages, whole pages of The Wasteland. Did you know? Entire pages. We love this for some reason. We love how fierce he was. The other piece of advice that I'll mention before I move on from this guy is, this is his directive to poets in about 1934. He told us to make it new. We're still trying to do that. It's just not specific enough. It's stressful. But people like Pound. You know, I've never really properly read Pound, I'll be clear. But people like him, these historical voices, they inform my own critical voice. And I imagine in your own creative practice, there are similar voices that would kind of be echoing through. And then there are the living critics. This is William Logan. He writes for publications such as the New York Times, the New Criterion, the New Yorker. He's a poet, but he's also a critic, and he is much better known as a critic because he's just a real asshole. He's just really, really mean. And again, just like with Pound, something in us loves how fierce and how cruel he can be. This quote, "It would be simpler to dislike Gorman if people didn't so obviously respond to the empty-headed blather she calls poems." This is about the poet Amanda Gorman, who was the poet who read at Joe Biden's inauguration. She's just recently come out with a collection called Call Us What We Carry. Look, I don't love it, but with this quote, he manages to insult not just Gorman, but anyone who's ever gotten anything out of her poems. That's a pretty big swing. He's pretty mean. So people like him. I don't pay too much attention to William Logan necessarily, but people like him also inform my own critical voice. And again, I can imagine that there are living critics who talk about the work that you do that might be sort of sitting there taking up mental real estate. But of course, there are people who tell us not to worry about this stuff and to just keep going. You might remember this lady. Her name's Elizabeth Gilbert. She wrote a book called Eat, Pray, Love. I'm trying to get a sense from your faces as to how you feel about this person. Look, I think Eat, Pray, Love is a great book. But after she wrote that book, Liz Gilbert, she tried to write a few other things. It wasn't quite catching fire the way that book did, so she decided to go for the self-help angle, and she really nailed it with that one. She wrote a book called Big Magic. And in Big Magic, her line was, look, what you need to do with your critic is you need to, first of all, thank them, and then tell them to go and sit over there, because while they are trying to keep you safe, they're not necessary, because all you're trying to do is just write a poem. And she told that story very effectively on a number of podcasts that you can listen to if you care to. I think we can learn something from Liz Gilbert in the same way we can learn something from Ezra Pound or even William Logan. But I don't know that her approach is... Like, I don't know how many people who bought Big Magic made incredible work as a result of it. Like, I don't own Big Magic. I do own... oh gosh, it's gone out of my mind now. I own a whole bunch of these kinds of books. But I don't know that any of them have like truly helped me to make fantastic work, but I think we can take something from it. It just depends on the day as to which of these voices gets loudest for me. Like, some days are harder than others. Some days I just haven't taken care of my basic needs. I haven't slept, I haven't eaten properly, I haven't spoken to the people I need to speak to. And it's just tough. And then on other days, I'm a bit more sane and I know which voice to listen to. But it can get really confusing with all these voices swirling around in one's head. They can start to conflict with each other. As I was writing this talk, I started to write down some of the things I was hearing myself say to myself about, who was I to be even speaking on this, and a poet is a ridiculous creature. We're known as these kind of sensitive flowers. And I decided to write down what I was hearing. And this is an exercise that I was taught by a trained psychologist, so don't worry about me. But, this voice is not sane, right? This is not a balanced voice at all. This is a crazy person talking. There's a gentler way. And while I do hate that kind of where I've ended up with this talk is to sort of be arguing for balance, which I don't believe in, maybe the happy medium is where we sort of need to land. This is a draft of one of my favorite poems. This is a poem named after its first line. It's called I Carry Your Heart. It's by a poet called E. Cummings. It's very sweet. It gets read at weddings all the time. It was featured in the film In Her Shoes, which I highly recommend to you. And I loved finding this as I was putting the talk together, because you can see that Cummings he's not drawing a huge line through his poem, but he's got some criticisms. I'm not certain as to whether that's his handwriting or someone else's, but you can see him, even though he's working on a typewriter, crossing out certain words and replacing them with others. This seems like reasonable criticism to me. It seems like Cummings probably had a pretty good sense of a critical voice to work with. He wasn't going full Liz Gilbert, everything I write is gold, and he wasn't crossing it out like Ezra Pound. So, yeah, these historical voices, though, I need to return to them, because for me at least, these people, these poets, they're so present for me. And as you can see, they are all a certain type of person. They all have quite a bit in common with one another, even though they all look quite weird, let's be real. But I find myself, when I think about criticism, the other thing I think about all the time is comparison. And the weird thing about being a poet is you end up comparing yourself to just some strange people, some very flawed people. And even though, Pound wrote a really great, very short poem, Cummings wrote that poem, it's one of my favorites. Keats wrote some stuff that is absolutely gorgeous. He was also a deep weirdo. And a lot of them were just very strange. They were flawed. They were human. I am also a deep weirdo, let's be clear. So I guess my corrective to myself is to try to move away from these critical voices and to try to move towards critics who are a little bit more anonymous. I have a poetry teacher called Josh. He knows what I'm going for with my work. I've worked with him for a couple of years now. He's really, really honest and really, really kind. So I try to listen to him. I have a friend called Lou. She's a poet who works up in Sydney. She and I write kind of similar stuff, and she's, she cares about me and she gives me really good notes. And I have a friend called Allan who also lives in Sydney. She and I are kind of at the same stage as poets, and we kind of cheerlead each other on. So on better days, I try to keep it just to that. And I try to stay away from the menagerie. So I guess what I'd like to end with is just an invitation to you to think about who are these people in your lives, and which voices you'd like to listen to. I will leave it at that. Thank you very much.